What's up guys, Asian here again with another build basics video, and today we're going to be talking about penetration, kind of what spell penetration, physical penetration is, what it means for your damage, as well as what your sources of penetration are, and also what add-ons you can put on if you're on PC in order to check your penetration. So the first thing we're going to start off with is what exactly is penetration. You can think of penetration as kind of the antithesis of resistances. You can think of it as basically the opposite of what resistances are able to do. So if you guys remember, the resistance cap for players is 33,000. The resistance cap for trials and dungeon mobs and bosses is 18,200, and the resistance cap for overland mobs is 9,100. So those basically what penetration does is it reduces the enemy's resistances. It lets you basically penetrate through those resistances in order to deal more damage. So you can basically think of it as resistances minus penetration is equal to the effective resistance of that boss or that player or the mob. So when we talk about the penetration cap in PvE, when we say 18,200 is the penetration cap, we're basically saying that because the resistance cap of trials bosses and trials mobs are 18,200, any additional penetration beyond that is going to be wasted because that equation, resistance minus penetration, it can't go any lower than 0. So 0 is basically the lowest that you can go. So if you have, for example, 20,000 penetration, then you're basically wasting 1,800 of that penetration because there's really nowhere for it to go because you can't have a negative number as a resistance. So that's what we mean when we say over penetration, and generally speaking it's going to be a pretty big DPS loss. In those scenarios you're probably going to want to basically take those sources of penetration that you have and move them somewhere else. So maybe someplace like if it's through spell erosion, you might want to move them into like Elfborn or something like that, or if you were using sharpened weapons you might want to use something like a Nern weapon or an infused weapon instead. So that's basically what penetration does. Now just like resistances, penetration has a certain value which is correspondent to a percentage of your damage done. So that value is the same as resistances. It's 660. So every 660 penetration that you gain, you get 1% additional damage dealt, assuming of course you're not over penetrating at all. So basically, to kind of show you what I mean by that, I'm just going to do basically a couple of attacks on this dummy here, and then we're going to apply, let's see here, we're going to apply Elemental Drain, which gives us Major Breach, which reduces spell resistance by 5280. You can think of basically anything that reduces enemy spell resistance or physical resistance as an increase to your own penetration. So by reducing the resistances by 5280, we should be gaining about 8% additional DPS on our average hits with all of our abilities here. So for example, I don't have any proc set. The only proc set I have is Scoria. So Scoria's proc sets are affected by penetration as well. So if you're below the penetration cap, so for example, Scoria's here says it will hit for 13,950. That's going to be reduced based on the amount of resistances remaining on the boss. So if I have no penetration, then it'll be reduced by however much resistances that the enemy has. So if it's an overland mob, 9,100. If it's a PvE mob, it's going to be 18,200. And if I have complete penetration, then it will deal all almost 14,000 damage. So remember, this is without Major Breach, so this is just plain. We're not really we're just having our native penetration sources. So once we get out of combat here, and then we'll do one more with Breach, and I'll show you guys the percentage difference that you can get. So remember that Breach, we should be seeing about an 8% increase in damage. It's obviously going to be variable depending on things like RNG of crit hits and specific damage done factors and things like that. Alright, so now once we get out of combat here, we'll go ahead and compare average hits. Okay. So you can see here that our average hits with our light attacks is about 7624. Falcon's Scoria hit for 12,000 or so. And then we have all of these. So Crippling Grasp hits for an average about 5k, Blockade about 2.5k. And we can see here that everything is much lower here without Breach. So if we just take a look at, let's say, our light attacks here, I'm going to be doing this math off screen real quick. So our light attacks without Breach gives us 68 36 as the average, and then if we swap over to our major breach parse, it's 7624, so minus 7624. So that is about a 10% increase in DPS. So the actual number is 10.47% increase. So it's higher than 8%. So like I said, if everything was ideal in basically a vacuum, it would be an 8% increase to our damage done. But because of crit chances, things like that, so you can see here we had a little bit higher crit here. There is a little bit of variability here. It's going to be anywhere between 8 to 10% in reality increase. So if you can basically say, for ease of calculation, you can just say it should be about a 10% increase in DPS because of the damage equations and how everything sort of plays out together. So while we're on our combat metrics report, there is a recent update to combat metrics which includes spell penetration. And so there's also a percentage over penetration. So if you hover over the over penetration value, it'll tell you what percentage of time you were at that specific penetration value. So you can see here, I was at 11,247 for 100% of the fight, and over here I was at 5987 for 100% of the fight here. And they did also update constellations as well in order to take advantage of this. So if I do combat metrics import, you'll see that it actually imports in my spell and weapon penetration now. So this is something that you should pick up if you're on PC and you want to kind of optimize yourself for PvE trials. Just pick up the newest version of combat metrics and constellations, and it'll tell you what your spell penetration is. So that's what spell penetration is. Physical penetration is basically the exact same thing, except it's just for stamina. So spell penetration basically boosts your damage dealt with magic damage. Anything that says it deals magic damage, flame damage, shock damage, or frost damage. Physical penetration will increase the damage dealt by anything that says physical damage, including bleeding effects, poison damage, and disease damage. Finally, there is Oblivion Damage as well. That's not affected by penetration or resistances at all. That's just a flat damage. It's what we call true damage. Alright, so now that we've talked about what penetration is and kind of how it helps you DPS, let's talk about where penetration can come from. So for spell, we'll start off first with spell penetration. So spell penetration has a couple of sources unique to itself. So under the light armor skill line, you'll have concentration. When you have 5 or more pieces of light armor equipped, you have 4884 with when you have it maxed out. When you have 1 out of 2, I believe it is half that, so 2442. So this is one of your primary sources of spell penetration. Major Breach is another source of spell penetration, or rather a spell resistance debuff. So remember that you can think of any debuff as an increase to your own personal penetration. So this increases your penetration by 5280. That's Major Breach, so you can't stack Major Breach on top of each other. So for example, Pierce Armor also applies Major Breach, but if you have Pierce Armor and Elemental Drain, the Major Breaches do not stack on top of each other because they are named buffs. However, there is a Minor Breach. Minor Breach can be, usually it's obtained through Power of the Light from a Stamina Templar, and that reduces spell resistance by 1320. There is one other source of Minor Breach, and that are Minor Breach poisons. You're not really going to be seeing those run too much in PvE, just because for Magicka at least, the enchants are a lot more powerful than any poison will be. So those are some of your primary sources of spell penetration, and then under the champion points line, let's see, I think it's under the apprentice, you have spell erosion, which increases your spell penetration based on how many points you have into spell erosion. If you put 100 points into spell erosion, that's going to be 5280, so it's pretty much an additional Major Breach, and this does stack with Major Breach. If you max it at 50 though, you'll be sitting at 3960, so there are diminishing returns when it comes to how many points you're putting into spell erosion. A lot of people don't really put too many points into spell erosion. They usually max out at about 30 to 35, just because of those diminishing returns. Alright, so those are the spells penetration specific sources. I will not swap over to a stamina DPS, but I will kind of go over the physical penetration sources as well, that are unique to physical penetration. So just like how spell penetration has their own debuffs, Major Breach and Minor Breach. Let's see, do I have it? No, I don't. Actually, I might have it here, yeah. So physical penetration has their own named debuffs, Major Fracture and Minor Fracture, which decreases physical resistance by the same amounts. So 5280 for Major Fracture, 1320 for Minor Fracture. So Major Fracture, you're typically going to see that being from the tank using their taunt, so Pierce Armor. There are other sources of Major Fracture though, so for example Nightblade's, I don't think I have it here, so yes I do. So Surprise Attack afflicts Major Fracture as well. Mark Target does on a Nightblade, so there are several sources of Major Fracture. Minor Fracture, there's not as many sources. Typically it's going to be coming from a Stamina Templar running Power of Delight. There are two other sources of Minor Fracture though, Minor Fracture Poisons, which again you're not really going to see people running too much, just because Double Ravage Health Poisons are much stronger in terms of DPS. And then the second source is also going to be a pretty rare occurrence, and that's going to be from one of the morphs of Snipe. I want to say it's Focused Aim, so that also applies Minor Fracture, but you're really not going to see that too much, perhaps on a Bobo build, on a Nightblade, or maybe even a Warden, but you're not really going to see it used too much in PvE. So your primary source of Minor Fracture is going to be coming from Power of Delight from a Stamina Templar, or perhaps a Templar Healer. Unlike Magicka DPS, there are no increases to your physical penetration under the medium armor passives. These are all based on weapon damage and weapon crit. But there is a passive in this CP line under Piercing, which is basically the exact same thing as Spell Erosion, just with physical penetration. So it caps out at 5280 at 100, with 50 points you're sitting at 3960, and so the whole diminishing returns comes into play again here with Piercing. Now there are a couple of sets that also decrease physical resistances on the boss. So the classic ones are going to be Night Mother's Gaze and Sunder Flame. So Night Mother's Gaze is crafted. It requires 6 traits, so you will be able to craft it from the last zone in each alliance. So that's Reaper's March, the Rift, and Bankorai. So whenever you deal critical damage, it reduces enemy physical resistance by 2580. Because this is a reduction on physical resistances, this affects everybody in the group and not just you. So that's Night Mother's Gaze. The other set that you are going to see being worn is going to be Sunder Flame. Sunder Flame is a dropped set from City of Ash. It is the medium armor set there. When you deal damage with a fully charged heavy attack, you deal X amount of flame damage and reduce the enemy's physical resistance by 3440 for 8 seconds. So again, this is a reduction on physical resistance, so it affects everybody in the group. Now there are 2 sets for that increase your physical penetration. And let me see if I have it. So that's going to be Spriggans. Spriggans here, okay, so I can't actually, let me pop out the, nope, okay, I can't pop out data here. Oh, yes I can, there we go. So Spriggans, when it's fully golded out, increases your physical penetration by 3450. So this is your own personal penetration. So it's not affecting anybody else in the group. So it's considered a more selfish set. And then another set that increases your physical penetration is Two-Fanged Snake. Let me see if I have a gold. Yes, I do. So Two-Fanged Snake, when you deal damage, your physical penetration is increased by 860 for 3 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. This results in a 4300 additional physical penetration when it's full and you get all 5 stacks. So this is a little bit stronger than Spriggans. So Spriggans is a medium armor set that's dropped from not Malabaltor, Bankorai, and then Two-Fanged Snake is a dropped set from only Sanctum Ophidia, both normal and vet. For the gold jewelry, you need to do it on vet, but you can get the armor from just running normal Sanctum Ophidia. And then finally, one thing I did forget to mention, because I don't think I have any. Yeah, I don't. There is a set that increases spell penetration. That's going to be Spinner's Robes. That's a dropped set. It's a light armor set from Malabaltor. And it's basically the Magicka version of Spriggan, so it'll increase your spell penetration by 3450. So that, again, doesn't affect the group, it only affects you personally. And then finally, there is one set that affects both spell and physical penetration, and that is Alkosh. So whenever you activate a synergy, you will deal damage with a shockwave, and it reduces physical and spell resistance of any enemy hit by 3010 for 10 seconds. So this affects both physical and spell resistance, and it is a reduction, so it affects everybody in the group. Alkosh is typically going to be worn by the tank. A lot of tanks now are not really using Alkosh. We're seeing a more recent shift back towards Alkosh because of the changes to synergies and how much easier they are to activate now. But a lot of raid groups are still sticking with Torag's Pact, and I'll go over that in just a little bit for the more consistent debuff uptime. But Alkosh is probably the best debuff sets and the only debuff set actually for Magicka DPS right now. And so you can see here we also have something called the Crusher Enchant. So this is an enchant that you can place on your weapons that reduces both physical and spell resistance, so this affects everybody in the group. So the default enchant here is going to be 1622, as you can see here, but when it is infused, that's a weakening. So with an infused Crusher Enchant, it bumps up to 2108. And then when we have Torag's Pact, which is a crafted set, let's see if I can find a weapon here. Oh, I don't have it worn, so it's not really going to be showing. But Torag's Pact is a crafted set. It requires 3 traits, so it's going to be from the second zone for each alliance. So it's going to be Deshan, Grotwood, and Stormhaven is where you're going to find those crafting stations. The Torag's Pact will increase the potency of your Crusher Enchant. You don't see the effect here because I don't have 5-piece Torag's Pact worn, but it will increase it up to 2740. So Torag's Pact is a good set to use. It's typically again worn on the tank to increase their Crusher Enchant. Some tanks will combine Torag's Pact and Alkosh together, so you get the best in terms of the amount of resistance debuff that you get on the enemy, but that's really only for more endgame tanks, tanks that are much more comfortable with their survivability, as well as the min-maxers who are going for those speedrun scores. So that's pretty much it when it comes to penetration sources. Oh, I am forgetting one other source of penetration. Let me see if I have a weapon here. Yes, I do. Okay, so there is one other source of penetration here, and this affects both. Oops. Pop-up item data. So this affects both physical and spell penetration, and this is your own personal penetration, so it doesn't affect the group, and it is sharpened. When it's completely golded out on a 2-handed weapon, it increases your penetration by 2752. On a 1-handed weapon, it is increased by a half of that amount. So let me see if I have a sharpened weapon here. Weapons, 1-handed. No, I have one. I just don't know where I'd be able to find it. Here. So on a 1-handed weapon, golded out, it's exactly half of that amount, so it's 1376. And again, this increases both physical and spell penetration. So this is another source of penetration that you could potentially use. Most people will not be using sharpened. A lot of people will be using infused. If you're stamina and using dual wield, it's going to be a Nirn honed on your main hand and infused on your offhand. So you're not really going to be seeing it too much, but it is one potential option there. And one other source of penetration, and this affects both spell and physical penetration, is going to be the Lover. I don't believe I have it on this too, and I think I'm running the Apprentice. Yeah. So the Lover is a Mundus stone that you can obtain. The Mundus can be found in the first zone of every alliance, so that's going to be Stonefalls, Oradon, and Glenumbra. And the base amount without any divines is going to increase your spell and physical penetration by 2752, so the equivalent of a sharpened weapon. And then when you have all gold divines armor pieces, so that's going to be 7 pieces of divines armor, that boosted up to 4196. That's another source of physical and spell penetration that you can use. So just be careful with using the Lover because it is a fairly large penetration boost, so you just make sure you're not going over that cap of 18,200 for PvE content. For PvP, because you're going against players and they can have greater than 18,200 resistances, there technically is no penetration cap for players. Even if players go above the resistance cap of 33,000, you can also go over the penetration cap of 33,000 to completely reduce their resistances there. So for PvP, there's no penetration cap. For PvE, the penetration cap is 18,200. So to quickly summarize, spell penetration, physical penetration increases your damage done. For every 660 penetration that you gain, you will get about a 1% increase in DPS. It's going to be variable depending on specific things like RNG with crit chance and other factors, but that's pretty much the minimum that you could expect, a 1% increase for every 660 penetration. Spell penetration affects all magical sources of damage. Physical penetration affects all physical sources of damage. And then, of course, we have all the different penetration sources. There are sets, there are CP passives, you have the Lover Stone, you have Sharpen, and then you have a couple of light armor passive for spell penetration, then you have named buffs like Breach and Fracture. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.